So last time in SB 30, we talked about the Vietnam War, kind of the quick, quick and dirty history of the Vietnam War. And today we're going to talk about the civil rights movement for African Americans in the 1950s and 60s. And then if we have time, we'll talk about the 1970s. There will also be a review session tomorrow morning before school that we'll be talking about Unit 8. That's when I'll be talking more about the chapter 20. Your first 1A, we didn't even get to finish it. Make sure you come to that or at least watch it right after I post. I guess 1A, 1A. Okay, so civil rights movement in the 1960s or 1950s. We really started off in this chapter talking about Brown versus Board of Education. Oh, look how beautiful that is. Or shorten it just to Brown versus Board. And Brown versus Board decided what? Outlaw segregation in schools. This is one way you can strike down a legal discrimination is by going to the court system. However, we also talked about how it's very difficult, takes a long time, it's very expensive, and you could be spending over a year and a half doing it, and the Supreme Court might vote against it. So it's a very difficult, long, expensive process. So there's going to be a lot of different other strategies used to fight for more rights. However, before Brown versus Board of Education, we have a national a nationally recognized event that the whole country is shocked about, and that was the murder of Emmett Till. That gains national recognition for its grisly nature, targeting this young man because of this perceived infraction that he does against a white woman. That allegation wasn't even true. Fast forward to Little Rock. Remember, Little Rock was going to integrate. And what did the governor of Arkansas do in response? National Guard shuts it down. They stop the integration. And President Eisenhower doesn't like this, so what does he do? Ike sends federal troops. And those federal troops, members of the Army, are going to integrate the school. Okay? He says you cannot go against the Supreme Court like this. You are outwardly challenging national authority, and that's not okay. Okay, questions about this so far? Fast forward to December of 1955, and we have the Montgomery bus boycotts. So what's a boycott? Not participating, not buying something. In this case, they're not riding the buses, they're not paying that fare. Instead, they're going to walk, they're going to carpool, they're going to get different ways of getting to where they need to go. And of course, the person who launches this is who? Rosa Parks. Again, her arrest creates a media sensation, and groups are going to use this to form the boycott. Groups come out of this like the SCLC. Remember, they're typically more middle-aged, more religious, less confrontational, right? A boycott is less confrontational. We have a new leader coming out of this, Martin Luther King. He's the first president of the SCLC, and he's going to be one of, obviously, the most important leaders of the movement. Eventually, the bus boycott is successful because of all the things we talked about in class. creating a pattern or at least a list of different factors that made it successful that other movements are going to use in the future. Oh, the boycott was successful because of this, because of that. Let's try that again. Now, after the boycott, some, especially young activists, will argue they need to try a different tactic in being more confrontational. One way they did that is through the sit-in movements. Okay? Like at Greensboro, North Carolina, where they go to a restaurant that has a policy or maybe a local law segregating restaurants and lunch counters, and they sit there knowing they're not going to be served, but trying to, one, take away the economic ability for that restaurant to make money, but also to protest this unfair law. More confrontational. This was done by groups that splintered off the SCLC, like, does anyone remember what the other group is called? SNCC, or SNCC for short. Typically younger, more confrontational, and doing the sit-in movement is more confrontational. It often led to violence on the part of protesters. Pick up the protesters, rip them off the chairs, so on. Now, the sit-in movements were successful. They don't just stay in Greensboro. Many young people from around the country will do this. And we even see it in the freedom rides, where young people are going to ride buses down to bus stops and waiting rooms in southern states where they're supposed to be desegregated, and they're going to do sit-in movements there. Again, it creates media attention, but it also creates setbacks, like when KKK members threw a firebomb at one of the buses. But through perseverance and through media attention, they're able to create enough pressure on the ICC to get bus stops, waiting rooms desegregated. We talked about Birmingham and how young people there are going to protest in something called Project C, where young people are going to go on mass marches, protests, walks throughout the counties or the city square, participate in sit-in movements and protest of segregation laws in the city. They're met with violence by police through the use of dogs, fire hoses, clubs to get them to disperse. They'll ask for help. Martin Luther King Jr. will come in. He will be arrested, and he writes the letter from the Birmingham jail. And in that letter, he is going to defend nonviolent civil disobedience. The idea that it is okay to break unjust laws. The movement is now more than ever before pushing for a national law that would outlaw segregation. And so to pressure Congress to pass this law, they come up with the largest gathering so far. What was that called? From Washington. Had lots of different goals, but one of the biggest goals was to support a national civil rights bill, a law that would get rid of segregation around the country. And of course, at the end of the March on Washington, we have the I Have a Dream speech. Later that year, JFK would be assassinated, and the new president, Lyndon B. Johnson, would kind of use that that death to get support of different bills that he wants passed, including this civil rights bill, which leads us to Act of 1964. And in that law, they're going to outlaw discrimination in public spaces. Now, so far, discrimination, or I guess the fight for laws against segregation, has been going on since the Civil War. And now, with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the goal has been accomplished. So now the question is, what does the movement turn to next? What do they turn to next? What do they turn to next? Not segregation, they turn to voting restrictions. So they look at voting restrictions that are still in place. What are some examples of voting restrictions? Poll tax, literacy tests, barriers put in registration. Okay, if you can't register to vote, you can't even vote. Okay. And so they're going to push for voting rights. We see this in the summer of 1964, called the Freedom Summer. They try to get people registered. However, they're met with lots of barriers to this, lots of rules that are basically designed to make it more difficult for African Americans to register. And so later that year, we have, the next year in the spring, we have the Selma March, where they're going to march from Selma, Alabama to the Capitol in protest of voting restrictions. Initially, the first march is met with violence. Second march is successful. And later that year, they would pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which outlaws literacy tests. "24th Amendment, eventually get rid of the poll tax. Good so far? So I know I'm going fast. Remember, I'm filming it, so if you need to go back and watch it, you can, okay? Now it's 1965. And the question is, now what? Now they're going to go after de facto segregation. So these are not laws. It's discrimination that happens because of organizations or individual people, right? We talked about this when we talked about how suburbs discriminated by saying, oh, people of color cannot come into this suburb. That wasn't a law created by the government. That was a policy created by the Suburb Home Owners Association. Okay. And so through policies like that, that creates discrimination and segregation. And so how do you get rid of that? They're not laws, how do you stop it? And different groups are going to have different ideas of how to do that. For example, the Black Power movement discussed the more political power for African Americans, more control over communities, more control over businesses. Pride in oneself, pride in your race. We see the Black nationalist movement, which takes these ideas, more political power, pride in oneself, and then expands on that by also arguing for, I'm going to use the word voluntary separatism. The idea that African Americans should separate themselves from white Americans, should live in communities where they can control the politics, the businesses, the rules of law, and stuff like that. Many Black nationalists argue that by living alongside white Americans, they will never truly get equality. So why try? Some groups like the Black Panther Party will argue for this. They'll argue for more community help. So we talked about how like the Black Panther Party provided free health care, free daycare programs for mothers, for children of mothers. We talked about Malcolm X, who initially believed in voluntary separatism, who also believed in violence and self-defense, including all of this other stuff, more political power, pride in oneself, voluntary separatism, more community help. Black Panther Party also believed in violence and self-defense. Different perspectives on what to do to gain equality in the future when there's no necessarily laws to fight against. Questions so far? If we're sticking with the 1960s, we also have other groups who are looking for more rights. We talked about the Chicano movement. Oops. Not China. Primarily Mexican Americans or immigrants from other Central or South American countries coming to the United States and wanting more rights. One of the famous leaders of this movement is Cesar Chavez, who is going to organize unions and strikes for grape farm workers. And is successful in getting union recognition in the 1960s. We also talked about the American Indian Movement, or AIM, fighting for Native American rights. And how AIM specifically was a group that was going to be much more confrontational compared to African civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s. For example, taking over the city of Wounded Knee, South Dakota, taking prisoners or taking captives, being in firefights with the FBI, all trying to create media attention surrounding the deplorable living conditions on Native American reservations around the country. However, it did not gain very much public sympathy when they took over places like Wounded Knee or Alcatraz Island in California, or took over the office building in Washington, D.C. For the National Bureau of Indian Affairs. This was not very successful in gaining more rights for Native. Whew. Okay, I just gave you a whole bunch, all of chapter 25 in 20 minutes. Questions about what I wrote about already? Questions about something I missed? Anything? Any questions? Okay, we'll end there today, everybody.